For all those on the blue ball floating through space that they call Earth, it was a time of division, a time of hate, a time of violence, a time of war. Around the world, brushfire wars had begun to rage everywhere you could see on the map. Eastern Europe was increasing its intensity as men were being laid out on the battlefield, sometimes eviscerated and incinerated by the machines of war. The new machines, the drones, dominated the battlefield and actually had changed the way everyone fought in that area. The machines were vast in number and could barely keep up, but it continued intensity more and more and more with seemingly no end. In the Western Pacific, a small island had been engaged, attempted to be invaded, and this destabilized the entire area as all governments in all areas were trying to protect themselves by protecting said island. Yet, it was turning into a complete quagmire as the standard search and destroy tactics of the ocean were no longer there. In fact, it had become so much of a melee that sometimes it was difficult to figure out friendly from enemy ships. Due to this, those who had been the aggressor decided that they needed to pull forces away and reignited an old war that was on a peninsula to their northeast. This peninsula would bring waves and waves of screaming death down onto the southern portion as they pushed down through the border and into that southern nation. The southern nation sent the balloon up, popped its own rockfalls, and held its breath. The whole world watched as the defenders got in position and began to hold off what they could, but the reinforcements from what was north soon arrived. It was going to be another quagmire, and once again, as it did before, death would roam over all as entire mountain ranges were seemingly destroyed. The countries southwest of this area not only faced a country known as China, but they faced China and each other as the turmoil in that area had built up to a final fever pitch. They began to tear at each other with just short of nuclear weapons, yet the terrain made that most of their arms couldn't be trucked in, couldn't be rolled in, and it was going to be another slog, another quagmire, another rush of men trying to destroy each other. In the eastern Mediterranean, everything burned on all sides with a strange, unholy type of war that seemed to stretch all the way from the coast of the eastern Mediterranean and just kept going east, straying north and south and even southwest. It seemed as though the battle stretched everywhere, in spite of initial peaceful attempts to calm everyone down. This was not going to happen, as it seemed as though the leaders only cared about blood. This led to massive invasions that had to be halted, but at major cost. Due to this, violence spilled into the streets, and the fighting eventually went hand to hand, and blood not only ran freely down the streets, but even from the air, certain areas were completely changed to red. In the area known as South America, it began to tear itself apart as they attempted to maintain control. The reason for this was a sudden mass return of criminals that they had sent to another country simply to take the burden off themselves. The criminals then broke them financially when they came back as they started looting, ripping things to pieces, and killing whoever they thought they needed to kill. They damaged everything financially to the point that these same countries didn't just turn their weapons on the criminals, no. They turned their larger weapons on the aircraft coming from the north and the ships, those that were returning the people that they tried to push away. Far, far north, on the next continent, there was trouble. Though trying to halt wars all over the planet, every single one of their military branches was spread very thin, and they also fell victim to their own success and hubris as they believed that they could handle all these areas at the same time. They tried to do this while forcing many of their young into the services and also trying to call back as many as they could. Yet many of them had gotten wise to this and refused to do their bidding. Along with this, they had major financial hardships that were coming in due to all these conflicts, and also, like those in Europe, it was combined with shortages from all those breaking in and taking the food away. Sometimes entire shopping centers were shut down because they just could not safely stay open. Rationing of food became commonplace, and because of this, and everyone in that area was so used to eating so well, living so high on the hog, that when they were cut down on what they could have, many in the country demanded everything back, which turned into riots, mass larceny, violence, and inevitably, that is when the true shooting began. And there as well, on that continent that had so many weapons that they tried to make sure that no one would be dumb enough to start the major shooting, it had begun, and the blood ran free. It seemed as though the entire world was hell-bent on ripping itself apart and tearing itself a new one. They called this the slow burn of self-destruction, and it seemed as though the populations were dropping faster and faster and faster with no way of fixing themselves. Even those that retreated into the oceans did not find any reprieve. Pirate fishing fleets were now very common, and every time these fleets entered an area, they depleted the ocean so fast that marine animals even became vicious. Many times they'd be hauling their catch and they would be assaulted by any of these predators. Orcas, larger whales, sharks, it didn't matter. They wanted their food as well. Yet every single time they were being fought off. Yet there were the occasions where the marine animals actually won. In some cases, the whales actually breaching up and landing on the ships, many times to their own demise, but it did sink them. But it would not be enough to slow down the harvest from the oceans. While fighting off pods of hungry and desperate creatures from inside the water, something even more dangerous lurked on top of the waves, anywhere near shoreline. Local navies no longer even gave quarter. They didn't even call out if they realized the transponder was off and they knew that somebody might be illegally fishing. They would approach, and the moment that this boat tried to run, this admitted their guilt, and they were immediately fired upon and sunk. No survivors. At that point, anybody still in the waves would be left to the marine animals they were starving anyway. Beyond the borders of their own shores, there was a shadow war out on the waves to sink the fuelers and harvesting collection ships that were the key to taking down these massive harvesting fleets. However, it proved almost insignificant, completely ineffective, because there was constant movement of these ships, and they were sent out more and more. It got so bad that locals would take matters into their own hands, and they armed their own boats. They armed their boats with everything from pistols to full-on automatic weapons, and it didn't matter if it was legal to carry them or not. Most navies, most law enforcement would simply turn a blind eye, as this was the only way they could get the food back to the personnel, the only way they could make sure there would be food there tomorrow. And they simply let the blood flow again. One would think that those in charge of the planet, the super wealthy, those that believe themselves above all, believe themselves elite above elite, believe themselves to be even more than humans, would actually do something, force a change, force a peace, but instead they simply sat back and watched. They would even place bets on the winners to see who would actually come out on top. If anybody knew about this at the time, they would be furious. But from inside their own bunkers, from inside their own compounds, they cared not. The only time they would get upset is if they couldn't get exactly what they wanted, when they wanted. If they wanted shark fin soup, it better be on their plate that afternoon. But if they couldn't get it and their child was complaining, even for the slightest bit of issue, the slightest loss of dopamine, they would get angry and try to take it out on someone. They were so busy trying to get wine, women, and song that they cared about nothing else. It didn't matter that the world was tearing itself apart, but it still did not matter to them. While all this was happening, the governments around the world were still siphoning funds to put into their own black budgets. This budget that no one truly understood was something that everyone knew about, but they couldn't do anything about. Instead of taking these funds and actually fixing the problem, they would use said funds to make devices to stay in contact with species not of this planet, as that was their issue. When those outside the planet were questioning what was happening on this little blue ball spinning through space, the ones in charge claimed that the population would eventually fall into submission and they wouldn't have to worry. They had created a system that had worked so well over time, they knew that nothing could ever stop it. The system was simple. It was 3 parts: problem, reaction, solution. They had created the problem, created all the turmoil, just let it happen. They were letting everyone tear each other apart, making it so they were desperate, put them in the survival mode, and when they finally got to a certain point, they could bring in the solution, as the reaction was them tearing each other apart. The solution would be for everyone to submit to them and fall in line and make sure they were ready to be brought into the fold with all the other entities out there. The non-terrestrials listened to this, great intents in their eyes, and listened very closely with their multiple ears. But they had their doubts that this could possibly work. Looking down on the humans, most non-terrestrial governments were content with just letting the humans delete a large portion of their own population. Yet they did keep watch. They kept watch as they wanted to keep doing what they were doing what they pleased, in spite of what the treaties that they had signed with humanity said. Several different species had signed treaties, yet never followed through on them. The treaty allowed them to examine humans and humanity itself. They had questions on why could humans do so much? Why are they so strong? They shouldn't be. Why are they so resilient? They shouldn't be. Why are they so aggressive even though they're not fighting for survival anymore? Why are they so difficult to deal with at some times socially? And above all else, why are they so dangerous? After years, decades, and possibly even a century of abductions, examinations, experimentations, and taking multiple samples from humans, through all sorts of trial and error, they still were not any closer to an answer, a definitive answer, and it was absolutely frustrating. Many of them were getting ready to be done with humanity at large. Either they would simply leave them alone or eradicate them. But finally, after all this time, they had found a solution to the issue of humans, a final solution, and not just humans. A certain species wouldn't ever say it out loud, but they thanked the humans for something called gain-of-function research and experimentations on their own kind. Because of the results of this research, it is now possible to have a final solution to all the other species as well, not just human. Realizing what they had to be very careful, very methodical on how they were going to deploy it and how to handle it, because it was still a danger to their own species. Even one little whiff of this in the air would be enough to end every single one of them, and they knew it. The only question was how to deploy it. They couldn't just out and out go to every single species and do this. No, they had to come up with a solution on how to deploy it so that no one would know it was them. so they wouldn't face the wrath of multiple species and their fleets at the same time. As strong as they were, they couldn't face them all at once. Many of their best minds went back and forth and around and upside down, trying to figure out the best solution on how to deploy it. They couldn't figure out why their best laid plans were not working. Nothing worked in the simulation. Every single time, they were either caught and or destroyed. They couldn't figure out how they could actually deploy this much either. They would need a much larger fleet. They would have to find a way to do this. Eventually, after watching several human movies of all things, they realized the solution was simple and almost elegant in a way, if not for the sheer absolute barbarism of the entire process and what they were going to do. And it must be conducted simultaneously. They understood that, as not to show their plan to everyone else and not give anyone else a chance to be ready for what was going to happen. They needed to coordinate this perfectly, but if they did, the results would be tremendous. On Earth, the battles have been raising to an absolute fever pitch, almost to the point of launching atom-splitting weapons. They're so concerned with killing each other that no one seemed to notice anything in the sky. If they did, they might have worried. Unfortunately for the human species, the high amount of propaganda, the extreme amount of misinformation had been so overplayed in all the media that no one even thought to believe what was happening was true at first. When the word came out that the moon itself was moving, the only thing anybody cared to say was, "Is it coming down?" When they were told the moon is being pulled away, no one actually believed it. They did worry if the moon struck the planet itself, the amount of devastation. However, the human species would survive, although not very well, but they would survive. No one believed that the moon could actually come out of its orbit as it was locked. What the hell was going on? On the far side of the moon, where their sensors couldn't see, the lizard folk ships had sent out massive amounts of magnetic tethers to attach to the moon. These magnetic tethers locked onto the metal shell of the moon that was just under the surface, about 10 meters. They then used their massive gravimetric devices, basically black holes for engines, to pull the moon out of its synchronous orbit. This pull took only 31 hours to break fully away from the Earth's gravity well, and at that point it wouldn't have mattered if they had been seen or not. It was already too late for everyone on the ground. For a planet like Earth, this was a fairly simple task. Just hook up and go. For spacefaring races, you had to actually distract them, take them away. Right before they began to come out and hook up to the multiple moons, they sent out distress calls to say that the lizard folks' moon was actually out of sync and they were going to need help. Even at the best movement, it would still take dozens of hours for anyone to reach, and at that point they would have actually completed their task. And this would be enough to cover their tasks. A task that would be very, very difficult considering that some of these planets had multiple moons, up to 7. By the time the other species responded, their own moons had actually been removed so far out of their orbit that they actually had to be reclassified from moons to rogue asteroids. This action was taken for one simple reason. They needed to destabilize the weather patterns on the planets. This was an absolutely necessary step to continue the plan. Down on Earth, everybody could feel the disturbance, the gravitational shift of the moon being removed from its orbit. They could feel the disturbance in the force that was moving them around this rock. It doesn't even slow many of them down in fighting, as they were still interested more in hurting each other than the fact that the moon was gone. What does actually stop them from destroying each other? is the planet-wide storms as the destabilization of the atmosphere began. Continent-wide hurricanes began to form, ripping at each other on the other sides, as the shear winds, if you were caught in between, could rip apart a medium-sized boat without any issue. Typhoons in certain areas became so prevalent and so fast, it was like you were dealing with them one right after the other. Massive earthquakes due to the gravitational shift started breaking parts of the planet apart. The San Andreas split out, and the state of California was gone in a matter of hours once the split began. The Cascadia fault line was not another one to sneeze at, as when it finally popped, it turned 3 major cities into parking lots and sent a tsunami across the Pacific Ocean, one that would reach up over 400 feet tall before it even reached the other side of the Pacific. Anything in the center of the Pacific was going to be wiped clean if they didn't get into a bunker and hold on to something. Along with this, other fault lines began to crack and pop and shake the living shit out of everyone. Along with that, volcanoes began to blow all over the place as the fault lines began to push pressure in or release pressure in the magma chambers, and they began to spew all over the place. The only bonus was that the magma did not stay hot, and the pyroclastic flow could not go as far as it wanted to, as the amount of fluids that were coming out of the sky was just insane. You had not a pyroclastic flow full of volcanic ash. No, you had a flood of mud. The loss of life around the world became absolutely staggering, almost as high as the loss of property, as many were able to finally get themselves to high ground or something that was safer, but their own homes were simply wiped clean from the area. It was absolute chaos as fires burned, as these storms tore at them. The mix of water and fire was extremely crazy. Many still insisted on getting it all on video, never taking their cell phones away from themselves for a moment, trying to get just that last little bit right before the crashes of all that lightning came down and fricasseed several of them. The video would still remain, though. This is what the lizard folks wanted, what they waited for, what they hoped would happen, what they needed to happen. They know humans will eventually unite to survive once everything stabilizes, and they only have a very short window of opportunity to do what they came to do before they are discovered, and they need to do it now. They sent out dozens of ships at first, which turned into hundreds of small, bulbous ships that seemed to be some sort of carrier, as though they were carrying some sort of large cargo. It was nothing but a cargo hold, a pilot section, and an engine. If you looked at it, it was strange. And they flew into the atmosphere just above the hurricanes, trying not to get caught, even though one actually did, and was pulled down into the storm and just tore asunder. Many of those listening to the communications could hear the screams of desperation as that ship went down, and they saw the cockpit get ripped clean away from the rest of the ship. That was the last thing they transmitted, as everyone could hear the crash inside, before it was ripped apart and subsequently crushed afterwards. Those still above the storms would fly in formation and release their payload. Due to the massive storms, they remained completely unseen by sensors, as the cloud of water and the cloud of whatever they were dropping mixed together, and the strange chips that were about the size of a human hand simply fell in and began to break apart, as the shell holding them together was water soluble, and it released the danger inside. Every chip contained trillions upon trillions of units of manufactured virus that was mixed with a bacteria which was wrapped around in a fungus. As it reached the storms itself, it would break apart and spread across the entire planet, assuring that no area was unaffected. They brought into each planet, but Earth in particular, several different waves of these ships to drop even more and more and more of this type of pathogen onto the surface, just to make sure that they had assured themselves 200% coverage of the entire planet. The moment they were done, though, they left because they knew they could not afford to be caught. Even by the humans, they knew it would be a bad idea. And eventually, on Earth, the storm began to settle into its own brand new set of weather patterns. And on that, everyone took a major sigh of relief. Around the world, as everybody started to count up who was still alive, there was a surprisingly high number of humans surviving what they called the Judgment Day for their planet. The planetary storm has now left everyone with even less resources, and true to their nature, some areas of the world began to kill each other off even worse than they did before. Large portions would be completely annihilated from the population to assure that a certain group that had either more weapons or who was just meaner had a full belly, along with more territory and more women for themselves, which is all they cared about. The larger, more condensed the population, the higher the likelihood of a warlord or war bands forming to kill others simply for resources. Many of these resources were non-renewable and can be only used once, yet they wanted it. Their own hubris said that they will be the ones to control it. And if these groups couldn't have it, then no one will. The barbarism was absolutely crazy, as if they couldn't have it, they would simply destroy it, they would shoot it, they would burn it to the ground, and eventually there was no resources left, as they had scared most of the game away that wasn't already dead or rotting in the field. But there was one meat source that was around, and their barbarism forced them into cannibalism. The issue was the bodies littered the streets became a big issue, a much larger issue than they realized, because a body can't sit there for more than a day or two in the hot sun without becoming very, very toxic. And once it goes septic, you better not try to eat it. But they did anyway. Along with that, they had diseases now in their water supply that most of them didn't understand. Giardia, Cryptosporidium, and all the other nastiness that's in there, E. coli, and even more, was there to take them down even more. It was absolute mayhem, and entire regions of the planet are now depopulated. In other locations, though, a village or town would pull together and pool their resources and talent. None of them had illusions, but this was the way their society was in their region of the world. Even though it was difficult having to work sometimes 2 or 3 days without any food, they would continue because they knew that if they did not, they would all perish, and they would do anything for their families. In communities like that, not all family is blood. Due to this, they defend themselves very fiercely, and if anyone tried to take anything from them or anyone, well, that person who came in simply to take would not be leaving ever. The only time that they ever tried to take life was only for survival, as they knew if they did not conserve, there would not be anything later. If they took it all now, which is commonplace in many parts of the world, there would be nothing later, and they would be in an even worse situation. Due to their efforts, for the briefest of moments, it looked like they had survived the absolute worst of it. It looked as though they would be able to rebuild, to revitalize, to thrive once again. And to everyone's shock and surprise, those that had hidden in bunkers came out and actually offered supplies, realizing that they needed to be with the rest of humanity. If they didn't, they wouldn't survive, they wouldn't thrive, they wouldn't do anything but stay underground and die. But what was even more shocking was the fact that those that were not only hidden from sight, but hidden from society for so long actually showed up, and they brought something else with them. The hidden technology that everybody was going to need and everybody was going to have to bring together. And if they did not, then they, again, as a species, had a high chance of just being done. Much of what they were hearing almost went past everyone's head, as they had to be broken down Barney style to make sure everybody understood what they were talking about. With this new technology, if you want to call it new, much had been worked on since the early 1950s or late 1940s. Yet they had perfected it over time but kept it hidden. But now was the time for full disclosure, and everyone was grateful to have it, even if they didn't fully understand it yet. As full disclosure happened, it was clear that many of those explaining it were doing this simply to save their own ass, as they feared retribution from the populace remaining on the planet. They laid the entirety of history and they laid it bare for everybody to deal with. They talked about how craft had been forced down by electromagnetics that they had been working with, not realizing what they were actually working with. They had recovered craft and bodies, the incursions by other species into Earth, and of course, they mentioned the deal. Those explaining the deal were very, very worried that they were about to receive probably the worst beating anyone's ever received. They spoke about the abductions, they spoke about technology that they were receiving from other species, allowing these other species to examine humans. However, they tried to wrap it up with the fact that they now had this technology, and this technology was being given to humanity as a whole. Along with that, there was the suppressed technology that they had created themselves. Now, humanity had anti-gravitics to use, which was far superior to any drone. As far as taking any type of cargo one place or another, this would speed up reconstruction so fast it was amazing. They found out that the mixture of using frequencies and lights to heal the human body had such amazing effects, along with things like CRISPR, that they wouldn't ever have to worry about disease. In fact, they even knew how to make sure that they destroyed every possible disease that they had manufactured or come across, with the exception of one or two, which were just so damn adaptive that nobody was going to break them. Yet the one part that seemed to grab everyone's attention was the fact that they could regenerate and rejuvenate with this technology. A technology that everyone was afraid to hand out to the general public, as they believed that the population of the planet would simply explode. However, it was pointed out to them that the population was already beginning to collapse and they needed this technology 5, 6, 7 years prior. Yet, given the situation at this point, it wasn't anybody's turn to take any sort of justice yet. What also came out was a weapons development program, which made the current one look like a joke, like some kids trying to make a slingshot with a rubber band and a stick. There was also a food development that they didn't even understand was possible, but with this, they could feed themselves no problem at all. They could raise crops so fast that they'd be able to raise animals so quick that, again, within a year, they wouldn't have any problems with food. It'd be a tough year, maybe two, but that's all they would need, and they were happy for what they had. It wasn't until the very end of all these lectures that there was another part laid in front of them. This technology was actually being shared, as since the population was much smaller and they had to protect an entire planet, no one knows if they'll be attacked or invaded. They just don't know, and everyone must be ready, because now humanity doesn't have a choice. They must go into the next phase of their life cycle. This information, all of it combined, did not actually go over as well as everybody could have hoped. Much of the information, when they hit certain points, caused many listening to have panic attacks or go into shock, having a 1,000-yard stare, just standing there as their minds seemed to break. Many denied the evidence in front of them even when it was proven, and they just couldn't wrap their head around it. A few got violent, as it seems as though their power and authority that they believed they had seemed to simply vaporize in a fart in the wind. Most, however, have no choice but to simply say, it is what it is, and drive forward. And they tried. God help them. They tried. Only about 3 to 4 scant weeks after the Judgment Day storms had started, women all around the world began getting ill. It started with a simple cough that didn't want to go away, a runny nose, and blocked sinuses that made them talk kind of funny at times, but nothing anybody thought they couldn't shake off. After a few days of that, it elevated to flu-like symptoms, enough that many had to be bedridden. And as things progressively got worse, they started taking everyone en masse into the doctors. And before anybody realized what was going on, most of them were placed in the ICU, which very, very quickly became overrun with patients. Everyone was nervous, and rightfully so. They watched over their loved ones, hoping they would get better, hoping the immune system would fight whatever the hell was going on. But the doctors were completely confused. The few doctors that were still around were just lost. Even with the new technology, they couldn't figure out what the hell was going on. And before they got any more progress, something happened. It seems though females of all ages that started early getting the symptoms began to tear themselves apart from the inside. In the death throes of many of them, their heart seemed to rip itself to pieces, many of them screaming in agony, gasping at their chest, trying to rip it open as though they were trying to relieve some sort of pressure, and then they would simply stop. Everyone panicked as they didn't know what to do. They tried to shoot antibiotics, antivirals, anti-anything into the system, but nothing seemed to work good enough. And soon enough, 99.7% of all females remaining on Earth were no longer on Earth, at least not spiritually. Upon the autopsy of so many that fell ill and died, the illness seemed to enter the females through the eyes, skin, getting into the blood through the lungs even. It would go in through anything. And the illness would go straight towards the female reproductive tract. It was odd. They realized that the ovaries were the first things to be hit, and clearly the hardest thing hit, as they broke down and began to secrete a toxin that the body couldn't distinguish as friend or foe. Because of this, the body tried to fight this infection, if you want to call it, and got confused and began to rip itself to pieces, starting to tear apart the liver, the kidneys, the pancreas, you name it. It started eating everything. This would, of course, cause the organs to shut down, and if they were lucky, this is where things would end. If it didn't, that was when the uterus goes through a similar process. However, what happens is the virus, bacteria, whatever it was, change the fluid inside the uterus into a pure form of epinephrine. Once it begins to leak into the bloodstream, sometimes due to whatever the body was doing to rip the uterus itself open, pouring it into the body itself, the heart begins to beat so fast that if they're lucky at that moment, they'll stroke out, pass out, and not make it. Usually, if they did stroke out, it was multiple strokes at the same time, flooding the brain with blood and causing everything to shut down. If they survived through that, sometimes the veins and arteries would break under the sheer tension and simply bleed out inside the body, flooding the entire body with blood. But if the blood wasn't getting to the heart or the brain, well, you know what happens then. And even then, even if their veins don't pop, the heart itself begins to beat so fast that it begins to rip itself apart. And then the tension goes up, the pressure goes so high that the heart itself explodes as the valves can just not take the pressure. Usually that is when they reach for their chest, begin scratching in many times with such force that they begin to rip the skin open, ripping down into the musculature right before it pops and they're done. They just drop. within 2 weeks of the first woman dying from this absolute horror, 99.78% of all females on the planet are done. At least human females, which confused everyone at first until they realized this is how a bioweapon actually works. The few try to remain hidden as the family wants to protect them. In many times, they're offered protection from the government, and more often than not, there's some angry father, brother, uncle, or someone standing there with a rifle, and you don't know who else is there ready to protect them, and you know the female's definitely armed. And that man would scream out, "I will not allow my daughter or wife, niece to be some government whore." Or something along the lines of, "This isn't the old politics anymore. You can't just take them." Of course, that depended on what side of the planet they were on. With more than enough protection, usually by their own family, the population is still demanding answers. They demand answers on why this happened, why their moon is gone, why their planet ripped itself to pieces, why they just had to watch their most precious die in front of them in horrible, horrible ways. The answers they received were not encouraging. They were told, "It's not just here, it's everywhere." When pressed on that answer, those that still controlled some of the satellite network and were able to talk to the different planets showed everybody that other species are just barely hanging on, as all their moons, sometimes up to 7 of them, had been removed from the planet all at once, and they had just been moved out of orbit. And this caused even more issues on their own planets, depending on, of course, how strong the gravity was. Final transmissions from around the universe was over a dozen species crying out for help as their planets were tearing itself apart, and of course everyone else there. Many of the species were fragile by human standards and could not handle such devastation. Many of them were believed to be completely annihilated. As everyone began to freak out, realizing that this was a much bigger issue than anybody ever thought, some of the violence began again, many lashing out, not knowing what to do. One man finally got everyone's attention by getting on in front of everyone, having cameras pointed and saying, "No more secrets. We must unite and find out who or what did this to us. There's no more hiding technology, as we're going to need all of it to survive." As of now, we can all understand that hiding technology is now a hangable offense. Everyone cheered at this as they realized that yes, with this technology, they had options now. They didn't have to just wait to die. The men continued, "We will use this tech to survive, to thrive, and to reach out and find out who or what in the hell did this and pay them back in kind. With this new technology, we have something we did not have before. We have time. And I don't know about the rest of you, but I don't care if it takes another century or two. They, or whatever they were, sent all this devastation. They sent the storms. They sent the rain, and within the rain, they sent something to take from us, something you cannot take back. We now know the disease that took our loved ones was manufactured. There's no question. So when we find them, we need to make sure to bring the rain." Hello everybody, this is Syntax. Thank you so much for joining me on the first chapter of this series. Before I go, I gotta send out special thanks to a few of my supporters, and those will be MTF Guard, Erica Gem, SS Demon, Guardian Sage, and Brian Kemp. Thank you all so much for supporting the channel. Everybody else, I will see you on the next one. This is Syntax, ejecting.